Good morning, everyone. How are we doing on this cool day? And thankfully, it's not raining yet. But my name is John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside. Thank you for coming for week one, of course, which is Images in Historic Paintings Week. For today, we're fortunate to have Marcia Steele with us, who will be sharing her expertise and experience as a painting conservator at the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco and Art Care Conservation Studio in New York City, and most recently as senior curator of paintings at the Cleveland Museum of Art. This morning's session, Andrea del Sarto's Sacrifice of Isaac, Technical Research and Comparative Study. This talk will compare the materials and techniques of the three versions of the painting, which can be viewed at the Cleveland Museum of Art, Gemäldegalerie Gallery in Dresden, and the Prado Museum in Madrid. And the technique of the Cleveland version is examined in depth. I would also like to mention that this evening's portrayal of Georgia O'Keeffe will be here in Orchestra Hall due to the cool temperatures and the wind that'll be coming off the lake at that time. That's at 7:30 start here in Orchestra Hall. And as a reminder, I always do ask you, please mute your cell phone ringers. And please help me in welcoming Marcia Steele.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'm not a curator, I'm a conservator, so thanks for the promotion. But and also this is a wrong slide already because I'm no longer senior conservator of paintings, I'm retired. So that was my former job. So I'm going to talk today about Andrea del Sarto's three versions of the Sacrifice of Isaac. And this is a picture of Andrea del Sarto when he was about 30 years old, painted in the same year as he did the Sacrifice of Isaac paintings. He was a student of Piero di Cosimo. Vasari was one of his students. And Vasari is noted for writing biographies of other painters during his lifetime. And he had an interesting life. He went to Paris for a while, worked for the King of France. And the King of France said, go back to Italy and buy me some artwork. So he went down with the money and he bought his house and never went back. So, pardon me for reading this, but it's a lot of information. The Cleveland Museum of Art acquired the Sacrifice of Isaac in 1937. Spencer Samuels, a noted art dealer who incidentally advised J. Paul Getty on his art acquisitions, found the painting for Cleveland. In a letter to the Cleveland Museum research assistant in 1976, he recalled his acquisition of the painting and subsequent joint ownership leading up to the procurement by the museum. Mr. Samuels wrote, I could never forget such purchase. I was still at school at the Courtauld, and it was one of the first paintings I ever bought myself. I sold half a share to Thomas Harris, who was a young dealer then. He in turn sold half a share to the Durlacher brothers in New York, I believe for $12,000. The partners in turn sold the painting to the Cleveland Museum of Art for $20,000, so that's a pretty good profit. Mr. Spencer recalled the conservation treatment by the Drown brothers. I do not like that name for a conservation studio, but it was done in London prior to the acquisition by Cleveland. And let's see here. Here's the painting in Cleveland. It's very impressive in size. It's about 82 by 67 inches. And it's an interesting example of an unfinished painting. You can see it particularly in the right. That whole donkey is not even painted, just underdrawn. So this painting being unfinished before it went to the Drown brothers, somebody had repainted over the original unfinished painting. And so Mr. Samuels writes, we watched the upper right-hand corner being cleaned first, which, as you know, is the least finished part, and our hearts sank. Of course, when the entire picture was cleaned, we were delighted. My research into the Drown brothers conservation firm did not uncover any treatment records or images since the premises on Duke Street was bombed during World War II and the business ceased in 1987. All three versions of the Sacrifice of Isaac were painted in 1528, here reproduced in their proportional sizes. They portray the famous biblical story in which Abraham's faith is tested by God, asking him to sacrifice his only son Isaac. Accompanied by 2 servants and a donkey, they find a place where Abraham builds an altar and prepares the wood for the sacrifice. At the last moment, as Abraham prepares to slay his son, an angel is sent to stop the sacrifice, and instead, Abraham sacrifices a ram seen at the left of the composition. And that's that guy. Each of the 3 versions is fascinating in its own unique way. The Cleveland version has long intrigued viewers due to its unfinished state, with the preliminary underdrawing and initial paint layers left visible. Its incompletion has identified it as the first rendition. The Prado painting captivates the viewer in its reduced size and the relationship of the changes in the infrared images of the 2 larger versions. Finally, the Dresden painting is a curious circumstance where Andrea del Sarto covered a different composition by turning it upside down and reusing the panel for a large finished version complete with his monograph in the lower right. Infrared imaging, which I'm going to be talking quite a bit about, is commonly used in conservation. It's a special camera that allows you to see below the painted layer into the underdrawing underneath. Panel construction. As Rusty talked about yesterday, we love looking at the backs of paintings. The Cleveland panel is composed of 4 vertical members, vertically grained, each member tangentially cut and coming from near the center of the tree. The wood of the panel was analyzed as poplar and the center cross brace as European chestnut. And you can see those cross braces are the horizontal ones, and then those later joins or repairs to joins are called butterfly joins because they sort of look like butterfly wings. And this is an x-ray, obviously, of the painting. Originally, the planks were simply glued together with extra support provided by the 3 cross braces. During this period, various types of sliding cross beams were attached to the back of multi-planked panel paintings. These included dovetail cross beams inserted into parallel grooves, as seen in the diagram on the right. Trapezoidal in cross-section, as is the case with the Cleveland painting, as well as the Dresden version, the cross braces were inserted into carved tracks. The battens and tracks tapered from one side to the other, allowing a tightening of the join by sliding the batten in crosswise from the edge. Dovetailed battens exerted an evenly distributed force over the panel and reduced the movement of the support. The support of the Prado painting is composed of 2 pieces of wood in vertical orientation, with one join running down the left side of the panel through Isaac's arm. There are 2 horizontal crossbars across the reverse, one behind the bottom of the altar and the other behind the area of Abraham's face. Like the CMA cross battens, they taper from one side to the other. The panel has red paint on the back of undetermined origin. The central area has evidence of insect damage in the x-ray. Generally, the composition of the painting is more legible and opaque in the x-ray of this finished painting than the x-ray of the CMA painting, due to the additional buildup of paint layers. The Dresden painting has not been x-rayed due to the lead weight that covers the back and obscures the penetration of x-rays. And we know from their records that was added before 1840. It's not original. And here are the fabulous backs of all the paintings. The structure of all 3 resembles in the joinery previously described, with tapering cross battens slotted into the reverse of the joint panels and the wood grain of the planks running in the vertical direction. These show the similarity of construction with the later additions to reinforce the structure. And these, you have to realize that 2 paintings on either side of the smaller Prado paintings are really big. I mean, there's 2 people at least had to carry those paintings around when I was looking at them in the conservation lab. As an aside, the inscription on the reverse of the Prado painting has not been transcribed, but a researcher in the technical office of the Conservation Department there reports that it appears to be a text by Vasari. The paper on the reverse of the Dresden painting is a short description of a restoration done in 1839. So people do like to glue things to the backs of paintings. So Larry Keith, the Director of Conservation at the National Gallery in London, proved the similarity between the Cleveland and Dresden paintings by publishing overlays of the two paintings, one shaded in red and the other in green, in 2001. Using the actual dimensions of the two paintings, we used the recent infrared image of the Cleveland underdrawing to compare it to the Dresden painting at its actual size. Using the underdrawn image originally transferred from drawings proved the use of the same drawings for some elements in the composition. And you have to realize Andrea del Sarto is extremely well known for his drawings. Quite a few still exist. And this research actually came out of an exhibition at the Getty Museum in 2016, which included many, many of his drawings. And the reason that the Cleveland painting was included in that is because of the underdrawing that's visible on the surface. So it was the only painting in the exhibition. While the Dresden version is slightly larger, the main figures match in size and scale. However, the artist expanded the foreground and background above and below the figures in the later finished painting. Now, we did a lot of work in Photoshop with, changing opacity to see how well things matched up. When the underdrawing of the Cleveland panel is overlaid on the Dresden painting and the opacity adjusted, the contours of Abraham and Isaac in particular support the use of the same large drawing for those figures as the basis for both paintings. Overlaying the Cleveland and Prado paintings presents another story. The Prado painting is a quarter-size replica of the Cleveland version. The width is exactly half the dimension of the CMA painting, while the height is slightly larger, like 9 centimeters, than half the corresponding measurement. The smaller size of the Prado painting can be proportionally compared with the Cleveland painting. When the Cleveland painting is reduced about 50% in Photoshop, the heads of each main figure match, but the image must be shifted horizontally for the heads to align. On the left, you see the overlay with the faces of Isaac lined up, and on the right, the Cleveland composition is shifted to the right for Abraham's heads to match. The position of Isaac's lower body, and in particular his leg, is moved up and to the right in the Prado version. This indicates some shifting of the drawing during the transfer procedure, as well as changes made during the painting process in the reduced Prado version. The preparation of all three panels is similar, with the Cleveland painting revealing the most information about the underdrawing and preliminary layers due to its unfinished state. Underdrawing by transfer from cartoons was presumably done with the Calco method. In this process, the cartoon is placed on the panel with an inner leaf that is coated on one side. I don't know if any of you remember like carbon paper, but it's the same idea. And this detail of the donkey in the Cleveland painting shows the characteristics of Calco transfer with lines of even density and points where the stylus was lifted from the surface of the paper and restarted around the area of the saddle. So you can kind of see that. Let's see. Up in there. The lines are composed of charcoal black, gypsum, and brown ochre, indicating that more than charcoal was used on the interleaf. A thin brown toning layer covered and sealed the gesso surface and transfer lines with wide brushstrokes. A similar thin dark brown imprimatur was seen microscopically in the Prado version. And I have to say, I'm very fortunate to have worked at the Cleveland Museum because I did a lot of courier trips with paintings that were traveling to different exhibitions. So I was able to go to the Prado and examine their painting under the microscope, and I was able to go to Dresden and take an infrared image of their picture in the gallery. It was too big for them to move around just for one day for me to look at it. So the overall infrared images of the three paintings were taken with 3 different cameras. In general, the Cleveland version contains finer lines with more embellishment, while the Prado has softer, more abbreviated drawing. Through details, it becomes clear that the Prado is the second version, taking some elements for the unfinished Cleveland painting and reworking others. The comparative lack of changes in the underdrawing of the Dresden painting and its close similarity to the modifications made in the Prado version support the theory that the Dresden painting is the last of the three. In particular, the servants and donkey who accompanied Abraham and Isaac changed significantly in the Prado version, and those alterations served as the basis for the same area in the Dresden painting. The turned, semi-reclining figure, which is this person there, first appears in the Prado underdrawing and is then copied in the Dresden painting. Note the similarity of the distant cityscapes in all three paintings, remaining constant through each iteration. The area of the trees in the left background was left unresolved in the Cleveland painting and was partially used as a basis for one of the smaller trees in the Prado version. The branches were painted out in the CMA version with the same blue that surrounds the blade of the knife. In the later two versions, the main tree and smaller nearby tree were shifted much further to the left, allowing the knife to be more prominent and more easily discernible as its cool silver blade was contrasted against the wider single brown tree trunk. The infrared images of this part of the composition show that the Dresden version mimics the Prado nearly identically, with only a slight change in the angle of the knife. This change is also visible on the surface of the painting. The changes in the shape and position of the angel can be noted on the surface as well as in the infrared images. Here again, in the last Dresden version, we find the position of the angel of the Prado painting repeated with no change visible in infrared. By contrast, you can see the angel was moved quite a bit in the Cleveland version. A closer look at the Prado infrared image on the right shows traces of the plumper angel found in the infrared image of the Cleveland version. Apparently, the original more upright position of the descending angel was initially transferred to the Prado panel before that preliminary underdrawing was abandoned. Outlined in yellow, the original underdrawn angel in the Prado painting was slightly higher in relation to Abraham's shoulder, resolving the overlap of the hand over the shoulder seen in the Cleveland underdrawing. And some people actually think that the reason that he's never finished the Cleveland version was this hard to resolve position of the angel. So I don't know if that's true. I don't think anybody really knows for sure. But evidently, this was still unsatisfactory as the angel was then reduced in size and flies in at a more acute angle in the finished Prado painting. The underdrawn angel in the CMA painting was reduced in Photoshop to match the Prado's original outline. Unlike the main figures of Abraham and Isaac, who were reduced approximately 50% in Photoshop, the angel only needed to be reduced about a third in order to match. So the angel became proportionally bigger in relation to the other figures in the transferred underdrawing, but was then made smaller in the Prado painting. The difference in proportional reduction suggests a different cartoon was used for the angel versus the cartoon of Abraham and Isaac. So he probably had different drawings of the angel and of Abraham and Isaac that he was using and reducing at different percentages. This detailed comparison of the figures revealed that the seated figure on the rocks is seen in both the CMA and Prado infrared images. This figure is abandoned in the painting at the Prado, and a new grouping of attendants is created. In the Cleveland painting, there's more attention to anatomy and detail in the underdrawing, even down to the boot seen on the foot of the Cleveland version, which becomes a simple outline with pointed toes in the Prado painting. This shape is more akin to the foot in the preliminary drawing from the Uffizi. The lower foot of the seated figure in the Dresden painting was shifted forward significantly, as seen on the surface. The seated nude in the CMA painting is slightly larger than the preliminary drawing. An overlay demonstrates a 7% increase in overall size, indicating the use of a slightly larger cartoon taken from the drawing. Once the drawing is enlarged and rotated slightly clockwise, it appears that during transfer it was shifted from side to side, since the back and head match when placed to the left and knee and arm align when shifted to the right. In In order to match the same drawing to the faint figure in the infrared image of the Prado painting, remember it's not on the surface, the sheet needs to be reduced about a third in the size. The drawing was then shifted a little bit, again clockwise, and this is a close percentage of reduction in the size of the angel from the Cleveland to the Prado painting. I love these drawings, they're just fantastic. The drawing of the donkey from the British Museum has reinforced lines over the contours and saddle, which may have been darkened for tracing and transfer. Like the nude figure, the drawing needs to be reduced by about a third in order to match up with the Prado painting. It was really fun to take all these drawings and then make them change their opacity and overlay them and see how they all compared. The donkey in the Dresden painting is 50% larger than the drawing at the British Museum. In fact, a lot of the overlays of drawings and underdrawings and paintings repeat similar percentages of roughly 1/3 and 50% enlargement or reduction, pointing to the use of grids and tracing for transfer. No grids were found under the paint layers with infrared reflectography, but could have been used as an intermediate step. More subtle shifts in the face of Isaac reflect refinement of his expression and a change in the overall tenor of the story depicted. In the Cleveland painting, Andrea has not yet recreated the open-mouthed, distressed expression seen in the later two paintings where Isaac looks directly out. Originally, as seen in the underdrawing, Andrea had placed the face higher. The dark area in the middle of the nose, seen now in normal light, was formerly the end of the nose. The present end of the nose is painted over the original location of the lips. A more significant change is found in Isaac's expression, initially portrayed with uplifted eyes, not engaging the viewer, but looking upwards, perhaps searching for divine intervention about to occur. While the head and chin were lowered, the shoulder and back were raised in the painting process, resulting in a more cowering stance. The upward gaze of Isaac can be reflected in Abraham's expression when the underdrawing is reversed. The two images eerily compare with the drawing at the Ashmolean, in which the eyes, like those of Isaac, were also shifted downward from the original concept. In the Prado painting, Andrea also moved the position of the head, but apparently always intended Isaac to hold a direct gaze, even in the underdrawing. So you can see his little eye there. Once the drawing was set, we can turn to the Cleveland painting to decipher Andrea del Sarto's working method and order of paint application. Initial layers were painted up to and around contours. The areas of the Cleveland painting that are least finished are the animals. Two of the most finished areas are Abraham's drapery, particularly the red robe, and the pink and yellow drapery at the bottom left of the composition. This suggests the involvement of a workshop that specialized in particular elements of the composition, such as animals or drapery, leaving the more complicated and prominent areas, such as the faces, for the master. Early on, the position of the figures and the trees and branches were adjusted, and Andrea started to paint out many of the tree limbs. Elizabeth Walmsley, who's a conservator at the National Gallery in Washington, has proposed the term sfragazzo to illustrate the scratchy brushwork that's thinly applied in regular patterns across the sealed ground layer. She also found evidence of this in her examinations of paintings by Piero di Cosimo, who, as I mentioned earlier, was his teacher, where he initially applied the paint with quick scrubbing motions, producing a thin layer of color with lively visual texture left by the flat-tipped brush. The term sfragazzo is translatable to rubbed. The unfinished area of the Cleveland Sacrifice of Isaac reveal that the sfragazzo is found in nearly all unfinished areas of the painting. The thin red-orange layer under Abraham's red cloak, for example, is likely the same type of painting under the entire robe. A similar underlayer is found microscopically under the red paint layers of Abraham's robe in the Prado version. A description of the layering in Abraham's face is an example of the complex, thin layering found in Andrea del Sarto's work. 1 centimeter wide brushes were used to apply the green-blue background sky up to and around the outline of the head. Swirling brown and gray brushstrokes follow the contours and underdrawn facial features, hair, and beard, as well as the end of his nose and nostril, the area above his eyes, and opening of the mouth. Highlighted areas remained in reserve with little or no undercoat of brown-gray. Next, white patches for hair were applied, along with most intense pinks of flesh. The pigments in the nose were identified as white lead, vermilion, and pale red lake. Thinner pink for the cheeks was followed by a reddish-brown diagonal stroke, on top of which gray pink of the mustache is painted. Thin, dark orange paint was added to further define the cheek and area above the lips. Applications of these thin layers quickly covered the underdrawn lines. Frown lines above his eyes, for instance, were hidden by a few transparent layers and one thin opaque pink brushstroke. The opaque whites, high-key pinks, and transparent browns form the basis of light shadow. In the corresponding areas of Abraham and the finished versions at Prado and Dresden, the additional buildup of smooth transitions resulted in the soft modeling characteristic of paintings by Andrea del Sarto. So these were taken through the microscope. This area of purple drapery in the lower left exemplifies the astonishing thinness of the initial colors used to define the values there. Andrea started with a thin purple midtone, followed by more opaque brushwork of the same color for shadow, then applying the lightest highlights, all still allowing the underdrawing to be visible. The dark purple drapery contains transparent red lake, umber or iron oxide, and charcoal black. The yellowish cast of the ground showing through is the result of the thin brown imprimatura, which covered the entire painting before the colors were applied. The red robe of Abraham demonstrates his handling of drapery in its finished state. The robe was blocked in with thin red-orange, which likely enabled the artist to see and follow underdrawn folds. The shadows were then painted, following the underdrawn lines. The image on the right is a microscopic detail of the shadow pointed out by the blue arrow, showing the dark shadow preceding the more opaque midtone. These midtones were used to blend initial highlights and shadows. Thicker highlights and denser paint were added last. The red pigment is vermilion with charcoal added to darken it. The thin initial layers of color are seen on the surface of the CMA painting as well as in the infrared image. In the Prado and Dresden paintings, the thicker paint modeling and buildup of paint layers obscure the thinner underlying brushwork, seen only in the infrared detail of the area beside Abraham's leg. One of the more interesting outcomes of the examination of these recent infrared images was the ability to discern incisions under the paint layer more clearly. Incisions on paintings by Andrea del Sarto have been documented in conservation literature as early as 1986, with the publication of technical images and treatment of the paintings of St. John at the Palazzo Pitti. An article from that date included a diagram of incisions identified with dotted lines and also mentioned small incised lines are found in other paintings by the artist. The X-ray also shows an example of reuse of a panel covering an earlier painting of a different portrait. The incisions appear to relate to the initial portrait of the figure facing right. Using the infrared images of the CMA and Prado paintings, incisions could be located and superimposed on the painting. The incisions found consist of arcs and ruled lines that are not haphazard. They're difficult to see even when diagrammed due to their thinness, which can easily be filled with subsequent paint layers. These diagrams suggest that incisions were used to mark the positions and relationship between the two figures, as well as the placement of Abraham's wrist holding the knife, the position of the angel, along with smaller indications of the cityscape in the background. These incisions are most easily discerned in the infrared images as extremely thin, dark lines and arcs, often with sharp endpoints or tiny hooks that end in straight lines. I know those are hard to see, but you can kind of see that little dark line there. Here are the incisions diagrammed in the IR details of the CMA and Prado paintings. While the artist is not using the same exact placement for the arcs and rule lines for the Cleveland and Prado paintings, it appears that he is positioning certain elements in the composition, and the incisions may be some kind of shorthand instruction to the workshop. In particular, we see the horizontal marks at the center of Abraham's chest, incisions through his wrist, and long arcs that end in the vicinity of Isaac's forehead, as well as indications of Abraham's hip, where it is placed under the flow of drapery in the Cleveland painting, and along the edge of the leg in the Prado painting. The fact that they are sometimes reversed from one painting to another is intriguing. Recalling the overlay of the drawing of the seated nude over the Cleveland painting, it is tempting to suppose that incisions marked here in blue were preliminary notations for placement. Additional work in Photoshop was attempted to see if the arcs related to full circles or ovals, or if they were maybe used as a means of reducing the composition, but we were unable to determine that was the case. Since when the arcs are fully marked into circles or oval, there's little proportional relationship. It can be observed that the arcs are not always segments of perfect circles, most likely due to the human touch in their placement. As previously mentioned, the reduction of the main figures was done at a different percentage than that of the angel, indicating he may have used using intermediate gridded drawings for copying different parts of the painting. Incisions are less visible in x-rays, but can be discerned in some instances as fine white lines. And you can see those, I think, pretty well here and there. The incisions that were used for architectural elements, such as the altar, differ from the thin arced lines just discussed. They're deeper and wider and clearly more visible in the infrared image as well as on the surface of the painting. Similar incisions are found in the altar in all three paintings of the Sacrifice of Isaac. While it seems that the architectural lines should converge at a single vanishing point, it appears the precision regarding perspective was not of utmost importance to Andrea del Sarto, since they don't converge at all. Here are a few other examples where incisions were diagrammed on other paintings by the artist or his workshop. While the North Carolina painting may not be totally autographed, the types of incisions found there confirm his workshop practice, if not his direct involvement in the painting. I just love that underdrawing on the right there, it's beautiful. Following up on new information regarding the underdrawing and incisions on Andrea del Sarto paintings, I revisited CMA's portrait of a woman. And this is actually more typical of us Andrea del Sarto painting, with very soft modeling seen in the flesh particularly. A new infrared image reveals linear contours around the figure with incisions indicating the position of the arms, cloth, and eye. In addition, there is indication of some kind of curtain or drapery that was originally intended before the monochromatic green background was painted. It's not uncommon to find parallel lines or arcs within a painting, a small area of a painting. And here are two examples of this. I don't know, can you see that? These two lines here and there. It has been suggested that a proportional compass may have been used to enlarge or reduce cartoons or to measure distances, and its use seems likely as well for the parallel twin arcs found under paint layers in various artworks. The painting of Charity at the National Gallery of Art in Washington has the most parallel arc incisions of the works we diagrammed. On the left, numerous incisions are superimposed on the X-ray, incidentally showing similar panel construction to the Prado painting. Here we find another instance where the perspective of the foreground table is skewed, seen here in yellow lines. The incisions in the IR image of this painting indicate that small adjustments were being made for placement of head, arms, folds, and globe within the composition. The opposite situation is found in the painting of the Madonna and the Steps at the Prado. The multiple changes, shifts in position, and different types of underdrawing materials make the infrared image extremely difficult to decipher, While some of these underdrawn lines may obscure incisions, extremely few, if any, could be located. In any case, the freehand nature of much of the drawing suggests relatively little workshop involvement or need for incisions. The circle surrounding the figures of this gridded drawing at the Louvre might hold some clue about the relationship to the arcs found in the paintings by Andrea del Sarto. It should be noted that this drawing is pricked for use with the Spolvero method as opposed to calco. In this instance, the lines are pricked on the interleaf, and then charcoal is pounced through, and that makes up the line that becomes the underdrawn line. There are also a few straight incisions in the related drawing at the Uffizi, which also has remnants of squaring. However, in that drawing, the scale is the same, but the quantity of squares outnumbers those in this drawing 4 to 1. Returning to the curious case of the Dresden panel, in 2005, I was able to go and examine it, as I mentioned before. And I took along an infrared camera that we had at the Cleveland Museum, it's a more portable version, so it doesn't quite see as deep into the below the paint layers, but is able to reveal some interesting information. It had long been known that the panel was first prepared for a different composition and opposite vertical orientation, as in the catalog raisonné, John Sherman noted the upside-down architecture visible in the area below Abraham's foot. You can kind of see that there. In this detail in raking light, the upside-down arch under the painting is showing the relief of the outlines in the underlying composition. Lacking a Renaissance scholar in Cleveland at the time, for various reasons, people in that field had gone to other places. As a conservator, I searched in vain for similar stairs and arches and other Andrea del Sarto paintings, and I was unable to find anything like that. So the curator of the exhibition of Andrea del Sarto's drawings at the Getty, I thought, well, maybe he might know what is this composition. So I sent him the underdrawn image, and the result he identified and published as another version of a painting by Perugino at the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Cannes. Perugino had studios in both Florence and Perugia and died in 1523. The subject, painted in 1502 to 4, is the Marriage of the Virgin. It's known that Perugino reused cartoons for different versions of the same painting, and this is likely another case of such recycling. As John Pope Hennessy noted, the predictability of Perugino was a product of the way in which he and his studio worked, and this was in turn dictated by his extraordinary popularity. Once a cartoon had been invented and proved successful, it was repeated and recombined. Note the composition under the Dresden painting is off-center, indicating the right side and top of the panel were cut for reuse. Also, later on, they found out that there was some damage on that edge of the painting, so that was probably the reason it was cut. Subsequently, back in Cleveland, we were able to tease out some more details for the Perugino composition, particularly in the area of the presiding priest and distant figures. The image at right is a detail in the proper orientation for Perugino's painting of the Marriage of the Virgin. Andrea apparently flipped the panel to reduce the distraction of the underlying image. While the artists at the time were busy mimicking and copying one another, it's not 100% certain that Perugino was the artist of the underlying composition, but further research by the Dresden curators confirmed that the underdrawing for the Dresden panel must have been made by Perugino's studio. Examination of the X-ray of the painting in Cannes revealed the precise placement of the vanishing point. The orthogonals converge there perfectly. So now we know that that's not Andrea del Sarto. Comparison with the composition of the same subject by Raphael of similar date show both artists focused on proper perspective, which we've seen is not vital to Andrea del Sarto. The vanishing points in both paintings are located in nearly identical spots in the middle of the open doorway in the distant building. Unlike the panels used by Andrea del Sarto, or the three paintings of the Sacrifice of Isaac, the large panels used by Perugino and Raphael have planks that are joined in the horizontal rather than vertical orientation. In earlier works, it has been noticed that specific artists, such as Giotto, Lippi, and Botticelli, had exceptional carpenters, and artists in some cases would have consistently used the surfaces of the same bottega. Remembering that Perugino was presumably the original artist for the painting in Dresden, the vertical orientation of the planks in that painting is particularly interesting since it indicates that Perugino used different panel construction for different versions of the same subject. The horizontal orientation is likely due to size, but it is then curious that the Dresden painting with vertical planks is larger than the painting by Raphael of horizontal planks. And this stuff is so nerdy that only conservators would care about it. But still, it's a mystery how and why Andrea del Sarto ended up with Perugino's panel nearly 25 years after it was painted, as well as who cut it down and when. Perhaps the commission was never fully paid or delivered. In any case, the panel sat in the studio until his death, just 5 years prior to Andrea's paintings of the Sacrifice of Isaac. Large panels may have been scarce when Andrea was looking for the panel, when it was commissioned by Battista della Palla on behalf of Francis I, the King of France. A new hypothesis was put forward in 2018 by the curatorial staff in Dresden. There was a painter, Francesco Ubertini Filippini, as well as his brother, and they both began apprenticeships in Perugino's workshop, most probably around 1505 to 6 in Florence. Filippini was in Perugino's circle until at least 1515. In any case, he was also a member of Andrea del Sarto's circle, so it's probably he's the missing link. Comparing underdrawing with Perugino and Raphael to that found in Andrea del Sarto, the underdrawing is more elaborate with bits of shading and curlicue folds in the drapery. Incidentally, according to the National Gallery painting conservator Carol Christensen, both Perugino and Raphael used incised lines, but they were used to define outlines and compositional elements of their paintings. She further suggested that Perugino may have used the incised line in certain areas of his larger works, while pouncing was more commonly used in the smaller paintings. And here you see a few more examples. And you can see that it becomes sort of another shorthand way to identify who the artist is, because the underdrawings are very easily identifiable and described. In closing, these details of the intertwined hands of the three versions of the Sacrifice of Isaac reveal the progress from the unfinished Cleveland panel to the final version in Dresden. As thin veils of paint were built up in the Prado painting and finally in the Dresden composition, soft modeling of forms was attained. The hands in the Cleveland painting have only the initial stages of dark red, brown, and pink, delineating the fingers and preliminary blocking in for shadows. The Prado picture is the only one in which Isaac's hand is proportionally smaller, whereas in the Dresden version, the position and size, particularly of Isaac's hand, mimics the one in the Cleveland painting. The Dresden painting shows more detail in the hand of Abraham, but this could partially be due to condition issues in the Prado painting. In both later paintings, the highlights and fingernails were added last. Through this comparison, it is clear that Andrea del Sarto achieved simple beauty, even in a complicated arrangement of fingers, culminating in a gesture of compassion and tenderness rather than harsh restraint in the pause just before the sacrifice of Abraham's son was prevented through divine intervention. And this is all the people who helped me. So thank you very much, and I can take questions.
How common is it when you have multiple works of the same image to have the first one be unfinished? It seems like a lot of investment of time goes into it before they decide to change it.
Yeah, not common at all. Actually, that's a good question, because as you saw, it's a very big panel, so it's to just stop working on it, but it could because the commission wasn't fulfilled in the end, so he just went on to a different panel, which had maybe a little better proportion for what he wanted to paint.
I've always loved the clarity that we find in unpaneled paintings, and when you see all the background and getting it set up, how difficult was that to achieve, and what other people were involved in actually creating the panels?
Well, there were workshops that were actually wood carpenters, and they would make the panels. But the gesso, sometimes that would be the panel maker, and sometimes it would be at the studio, so they would cover the wood with the gesso, which is calcium carbonate or sulfate and water, and just seal the wood so you could then paint on top of it.
Marcia, I noticed in the Cleveland version, the tree has a distinct resemblance to a cross, which of course is very significant as a theological statement. Was that just because you think it was unfinished, or maybe that was an original thought that wasn't carried out in the later two versions?
Your guess is as good as mine. I think that's a good observation, though, yeah. There are some known drawings of other artists that he used for the figures on the right. I think there was a drawing by Lucas van der Leyden, who was a northern artist, so he used that as a basis for those figures.
This is more out of left field. Out of all of the potential paintings that can be conserved, I trust that there are many more of those, and there are people available to conserve them. How are the decisions made about what to conserve and what not to conserve?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, the only treatment I did on that painting was some adjustment of retouches that had been done maybe 10 years prior, but through time they began to not match, so I just adjusted them. But for major treatments, it's usually a decision made by the conservators and the curators, and when I was there, we had a sort of a running priority list of what would benefit the most from treatment, and other things that maybe would only need a little minor treatment. So, but it's, yes, there are fewer people than paintings that need to be conserved. Well, I need to be conserved. Okay. Oh, one more.
One more.
Early on, you mentioned the Dresden painting had the white lead added later to the back of that. Is it ever acceptable, given that it's a later addition, to remove something like that that's masking your ability to image, or is that considered heresy within the field?
It's considered. It's very difficult to remove lead white, though. You have to basically do it with a scalpel, and it's also extremely hazardous to your health because you're working with lead and it's turning into little pieces of powder. But my hope is that someday someone will invent a way to x-ray the paintings that have lead white on the back of them.
Well, thank you very much, Marcia.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.